Welcome, everybody. We have a lot of people joining the webinar right now, so I'm just going to take a couple minutes to let everyone join. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We're quickly getting attendees trickling in, so I'm going to take another minute to let everyone join, and then we'll get started. Okay. See the attendees starting to slow down, but Anna will just keep letting people in. Welcome, everybody. I am really excited to open this panel today. My name is Jennifer Hill Kerrigan, and I am the Inclusive Circular Economy Program Manager at Pixera Global, and formerly the Executive Director at a Circular City Coalition in the Triangle region of North Carolina called Circular Triangle. We have an amazing panel here today to talk about circular cities and some of the best practices. And we have a lot of attendees. I'm looking at some of the names, some of whom are familiar to me. So welcome, and welcome to everybody new. Before we get started with the panelists, I want to just kind of set the stage for what we're talking about. Then I'll introduce who we're speaking with today and then talk about a couple housekeeping items so we all know what the run of show looks like. But where are we at with global circularity right now? Material extraction is climbing year after year after year. In only the last 50 years, global consumption has quadrupled. So our take, make, waste economy consumes about 100 billion tons a year and wastes over 90% of that. So that means that only 8.6% of what is extracted from the earth every year actually makes it back into the economy. And that's getting worse every year. It's actually not getting better. It was getting a lot better for a little bit, and now it's getting worse. So we have a lot of work to do. And what we need to fix that is not just new waste management systems or more recycling. We need a whole new way to do things in order to fix this global problem. We need to shift our focus from waste diversion to sustainable consumption. And by that, I mean how to use resources to meet the needs of our global population while staying within the healthy boundaries of our planet. This also has massive implications for climate change because over 70% of our global emissions come from our material extraction. So solving this material and consumption problem will also help us with our climate change issue. Unless we radically transform how we use materials to satisfy our needs, we are not going to meet our global emissions goals. And lastly, we need to do this in a way that meaningfully improves the lives of all people, not just recreating our current system that rewards a few rich people at the expense and at the exploitation of most of the people on Earth. So how do we change and where do we start? That is where this panelists on this call have a lot of insight. I'm really excited to talk to them today. Cities are a really important intervention point for circularity. Cities consume over 75% of our Earth's natural resources, produce over 50% of the waste, and emit between 60 and 80% of greenhouse gases. So in essence, cities are where it's at. If you want to get the most bang for your buck, start with cities. Circularity in particular in 4 key urban systems, buildings, mobility, products, and food, can create substantial benefits for city residents. Local governments have a big role to play because they can adopt the policies and create the enabling conditions for a circular economy to emerge and thrive. They set direction for these 4 key urban systems. So to talk more in depth about this today, I want to introduce our panelists. We have Ashima Sukhdev, the Climate Mitigation and Circular Economy Policy Advisor for the City of Seattle City Public Utilities. Ash, could you just wave? Right, thanks. Divya Sridhar, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress Program Manager and the lead for Inclusive Circular Cleveland. We have Emily Yates, who's currently the Chief Innovation Officer at Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, also known as SEPTA in Philadelphia, formerly the Smart Cities Director in Philly, and also formerly from Envision Charlotte. We have Party Safari, Director of Economic Development in the City of Cambridge in Massachusetts. And last but not least, Andrew McHugh, the Circular Economy Consultant for Cities at Metabolic. So a few housekeeping items. We have a lot to talk about today. We have the system set up so that you can ask questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom. If you put your mouse to the bottom of Zoom, you will see something that says Q&A. You can click on that and ask questions right in there. Ana Luisa Freis from Pixera Global will be monitoring that, and we will be answering questions as they come in. So feel free to ask your questions as you think of them so they're more relevant. But also we will have a few minutes at the end to ask some questions as well. And finally, if you do have any technical issues, like for example, if you can't hear me right now, or you can't hear one of the panelists, you can also ask a question to Ana Luisa Freis. You can use the same system, the Q&A, to just ask your technical question as well, and Ana will help you. So with that, let's get started on this really exciting topic on circular cities. All of our panelists here have some direct experience, either in a specific city or like Andrew working across many cities with developing some circular models. So this is really the first thing I wanted to dive into with you all is your lessons learned. Some of you are currently engaged with a new Circular Cities project. Some of you are engaged with a Circular Cities project that's been underway for a few years. So I want to know more about what's been successful, what have been the barriers, and what are some things that you would do differently. Divya, do you want to get us started? The plan for Circular Cleveland is in development now and is taking shape with Pixera Global and Metabolic. Can you talk more about how that's going?
Sure. Thank you for introducing all of us, Jennifer, and to the audience who are here today. Share a little bit about what's going on in Circular Cleveland. We're working with Metabolic and Pixera Global to put together this roadmap and an implementation plan that will help us make the transition. The time that we launched this initiative was timed with COVID. So really, our hope was when recycling broke to really use that as a springboard to go beyond recycling and think about measures that can build on the already dense engagement models that we had in Cleveland, the small community grants and others, to see what lessons could be learned, how we can, springboard into a more regenerative process. But very quickly we learned, COVID was our, at the time that we had it, we've realized that true engagement needed to happen in order for us to be able to do this. Well, candidly, I'll say that we were not able to do that because of the pandemic. But one of the things that really worked for us is to change our vernacular into saying that it was not focusing on circular economy, but trying to say that this was something that generations have done, cultures have done, and that we've practiced this across the fiber, and using grants that we did, community small grants, to identify projects that people were doing so that we could mine some ideas to build that language that we can then use to share to make that more accessible. So we're not starting off with a lot of theoretical understanding for people about what circularity is. Maybe it just narrows into a few fields where we are all, where the community is, so we can meet people where they are to get started. And I think what COVID, if we were to look at the other side of it, the thing that helped us think through this a little bit more and bring more partners to the table, because we were having this issue of not being able to have true grassroots involvement directly other than through grants. It was helpful for us to see what were the grass tops groups that were already doing the work and partner with them. So really one of the things that happened was the mutual aid that came together in the time of COVID. That's those that began to share resources and redistribute things within themselves and their communities. That we began to think was a good model for us to think about how this would go long term, because this we're starting from 0 to 60 here because we didn't have a circular vocabulary, but we are trying to embed a circular vocabulary. So really knowing that it cannot be done in a 2 or a 3 year timeline, but it takes a really long time, starting with words and phrases that are most commonly used and practices that are most adapted. So I think that was really helpful for us in doing this. And if we were to think about something that would help us a little bit more, was to have an understanding of using these, using words and vocabulary again, because we are having a report and these plans that are going to come out. And we can't have, that you can't have the same language. We can't have the same language talking to both gatekeepers of programs and policymakers, and you can't have the same language talking to the people in the community. We need to be able to find a partner in the community who understands the technical resources and is able to translate that language to both sides. So if that's something that we'd like to bring more into our work, not just for circular streams, but also for other environmental and technical issues that are very data-driven, starting now, how we focus on.
Great, thank you, Divya. Emily, you have experience working in several circular cities at this point. Could you just kind of introduce where Charlotte is, where Philadelphia is in terms of the circular journey, and some of the lessons learned, especially thinking about what role cities can play, given that cities are not well known to be the most nimble of organizations?
Sure. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to talk about Charlotte and Philadelphia. So in regards to Charlotte, I think that, we implemented the strategy in 2018. We completed the strategy in partnership with Metabolic. And it was a really successful process. I think largely due to the leadership we had from the city manager. I think that's one of the key ways to overcome barriers, is to have that leadership at such a high level, be supportive of it. The city manager came to Envision Charlotte and said he wanted something that sets Charlotte into like a unique space, right? They did a study of Charlotte, and everything they studied about Charlotte was they were good in everything. There wasn't one thing that really stood out. And so having come from a prior 100 resilient city, he's like, I want environment, but we also have this economic mobility challenge that we've got to address. And so I suggested circularity to him. We took him over to Amsterdam, so they saw it in action, saw all the great work of Metabolic and the city of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and we were able to implement that strategy. And they now have an innovation barn that is a incubator for some of the outcomes that we created in the circular strategy. I think one of the reasons that the strategy was so successful is that we identified low-hanging fruit that could really quickly be implemented and scaled up to have more of a circular impact. Things that were already happening in the city, as Divya mentioned, and really just kind of adding that additional lens of circularity to it to scale and have that broader impact. So they're in the process of implementing their circular Charlotte strategy. In terms of Philadelphia, when I started in the Smart Cities department, I knew that circularity was something I wanted to push forward again. And I was able to develop a partnership with the US Chamber Foundation to sponsor the development of that strategy through their Beyond 34 program, which is working to reduce or to increase recycling rates beyond the average of 34% in cities. And they realized that we have to go beyond recycling. And so they brought in the circular economy group. We're again working with Metabolic, a common theme in my work. But we are a little bit slower to move on this, largely because I think right now, when we were working in Charlotte, we were kind of in a sweet spot. The cities hadn't been really, the social inequities hadn't been as brought to front stage as the Black Lives Matter uprisings did. We weren't going through a global pandemic and heading into year 3 of that. And so, priorities right now for city leadership are there's a lot, right? And so how do you kind of pick something to move forward and really have impact? And one of the challenges, I think, of circularity is that it's a systems change. So it's not an immediate overnight solution, which is what politics want, right? They want to say, I did this and here's the results. But we're looking at systems change, which should be over generations of impact. And so it's getting it in front of leadership here. They're totally supportive of it, but it's just moving a little bit slower, I think, in that sense. The other challenge that is a common thread, I think, amongst all cities is, the first level of the circularity report is doing a landscape assessment of where our waste is, what our waste flows are, what they're comprised of. And even just sharing that data took us several months. You think, oh, it's just waste data. But as a city, you have to be very careful with the data. And so I think that's another component of it that really kind of slows down the process. And that's the tension that we're constantly working against, is we need to move fast, but cities move slow. And how do you really navigate that and find the unique paths forward?
Thank you so much. Hardy, so you want to share what Cambridge is up to?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, and so much, Emily. Great to be a part of the panel. So just to provide everyone in the room with some context, Cambridge, similar to some of the other municipalities here, are working with Metabolics and Parexa on our circular Cambridge plan. So we kind of, a little bit to what Emily was talking about, where we did a baseline understanding of where we are in regards to circular efforts, and then what we could do in the future to make sure our economy is more circular. So I would say, similar to what Emily said, we have a very great support here in the city amongst our residents, as well as the city staff and city council on supporting reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, as well as efforts on making the city more circular. So that's a wonderful benefit we have here in Cambridge, is that we have a lot of leadership who's very supportive of these efforts. We have been doing a lot on reduction of greenhouse gases through working with our private industries, our universities, as well as in our housing and other public spaces, but we haven't really thought about the economic side. So a little bit to Emily's point of how are we supporting entrepreneurs who want to get into the circular economy, and making sure that we're providing, opportunities for everyone in that, so there's more equity. How are we making sure that there's social and economic mobility for folks? These are things that a lot of this city has been thinking about, and when we get to some other topics, I'd be happy to talk about what we're doing, especially around ARPA, around some of those things. But I think for us, we've had, I think Emily touched on a lot of the points. A lot of it is data gathering. That's a huge challenge for cities. Like, where are you, where you're at, especially on some of the economic data sets. It's just some things we don't have. And I think for us, similar to Divya, is we have a lot of great educational programming we offer to, especially our small businesses and other industries, but we don't really put that circular kind of layer to it all. And I think for us, a challenge and an opportunity that we're really excited about as we've gotten our plan going is, how are we educating using those keywords, to Divya's point? Because when you say circular economy to someone, I think for a lot of people, it goes over their head, and so that's a challenge and opportunity for us too. And then also, how are we making sure when we're talking to restaurants, we're thinking about food waste and not just some of the kind of recycling and other methods that are traditionally thought of when it comes to climate change processes. So I think those are some things we're learning about and we're excited about. And I think for us, it is similar to what Emily and Divya said, is adding that layer. And I cannot stress enough what Emily said, having the support of leadership to push these initiatives and get it into your budget is so key. And it's really great that here in Cambridge, we have that support system.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of a common theme of needing the leadership support at the high level within the city, up to and including the city manager, and also thinking about how to tailor the message, but not just about it's not just a comms play, right? It's not about communications. It's about really tailoring the focus to what people want and need. If you're going to talk to a restaurant, talk about food waste. That's what the restaurant cares about. That makes sense to me. I also am acknowledging there's a question in the right now about more examples about economic mobility in Charlotte. We're actually going to talk a lot more about that in detail, so I'm going to hold off on that question till a little bit later. Ash, do you want to talk a little bit about what's some of the lessons you've been learning in Seattle?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thank you for having me on this panel. It's great to be with colleagues and friends. So Seattle's in a kind of interesting place because we don't have a circular economy strategy as such. It's much more embedded across a number of different plans and strategies in the city. So it's an interesting perspective to come to this conversation too. We are in the process of updating our solid waste comprehensive plan this year, which is currently out for public comment. And that, like in the very first paragraph of that plan, we have a clear statement that says that our focus is on a zero waste future that builds towards an inclusive and circular economy. And in addition to that, we're also in the process of, over the next 2 years, coming out of that comprehensive plan, developing a specific waste prevention strategic plan that will be released in 2024, where the focus is really going to be looking at metrics and targets that can track progress off waste prevention. So it's a slightly different setup from Philly and Cleveland and Cambridge and Charlotte. But again, it's just a different way to approach the circular economy conversation. And part of my role, I'm a recent addition to the Seattle team. Part of my role coming in as a circular economy policy advisor is to explore what the vision for a circular economy in Seattle can be and whether there is that need for an additional circular economy strategy or if we just kind of integrate it throughout our various plans and approaches. So that's something for cities to consider as they're entering the conversation too.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That doesn't we don't necessarily need like a circular economy plan layered on top for a city that already has other plans. Sometimes it makes the most sense to integrate circular goals within a comp plan, for example, especially if a city is already in the process of creating a comp plan and you can really integrate that well. That makes sense. So Andrew, you have, looking across all the cities you've worked in, what are some lessons that you see common across different cities?
That's a great question. What do we see that's common across different cities? For me, maybe here's a lesson learned that is common across different cities, is that having that vision in place for where you're trying to get to makes everything else easier. It makes getting leadership on board easier. It makes getting other stakeholders out in the community on board easier. It makes picking which data to collect to actually build your actions around and which stories to tell and which metrics to use to tell that story so much easier when you know sort of from all the different parts of the city, what are the performance characteristics of this circular economy? Not like very prescriptively, it will do this, but rather in some distant future, we can pick whatever year we want, 2050, 2040, whatever it is, say, the city of X has no waste generation or has no pollution in its air, water, or soils, or the residents get the most use out of their materials without having to buy them new each time. You can do these high level performance characteristics go into a vision, make it really clear what the values of the community are. When I say the community, I'm meaning like stakeholders from the city, stakeholders from anchor institutions, from businesses, and just community members. For me, this is always a really powerful way to get across to everyone what we're trying to do and to get people to focus on what they can do within their lane. So I think in the Circular Charlotte project is a really good example of a really flushed out, really built out vision with the rest of the project oriented around making that vision a reality. The stronger you can make that vision, the easier it gets to do everything else. Another common thing I saw across the US, specifically when working with cities, is you can waste a lot of time trying to teach people what a circular economy is. And you can waste a lot of time trying to get all of the data. When actually it's a balancing act of getting like getting people oriented around the same goal and figuring out what you need to get to that goal. So a lot of times I'll talk to someone in a city government, circular economy, why do I care about waste? It's 2% of my emissions. It's really not, my focus is buildings and mobility. And then it becomes a more complicated conversation. You have to say, okay, well, when we talk about scope 3 emissions, all of the stuff that's being consumed in the city, this is actually the biggest impact. And the thing about greenhouse gas emissions is it doesn't matter where they happen, especially if you're a coastal city, they're going to come back to bite you at some point. So finding the right way to, the entry point. What are people trying to already achieve? And not try to say, not preach circular economy all the time, but rather just match it up. This is how we can actually get you to your net zero waste or your net zero carbon emissions or your economic mobility goals using this lens. As Emily mentioned, it's a systems change. It's not like, it doesn't have to be a standalone strategy. It can actually be a lens that is applied to all these other strategies.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And that's such an excellent point. Is circular economy is not the goal. The goal is just not to be a circular economy, right? The goal is all of these other goals, living within the planetary boundaries, economic mobility. It reminds me of JFK's moonshot speech. We are going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. That's a really specific, concrete, visual goal. And it wasn't about how we're going to get there, all the technology needed. It was just, we're going to put a man on the moon at the end of the decade. And so to Andrew's point, making a very concrete vision is what's needed to kind of move all the different parts in the same direction for these type of moonshot goals. That's really important. Before I move on to the next question, there was a question from Faith Legendra, who I know is in New York. So I'm sure is wondering about some of the programs going on in New York City. I'm not in New York myself. Is there anybody on the panel that can speak to any of the programs for circularity going on in New York right now? Not really.
So my previous role was with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and we used to do a lot of work with the city of New York. I know there's a lot of great sessions going on throughout this week, looking at what New York is doing on circular economy. So my information's a bit outdated, so I'll refer you to those sessions.
Great, thank you. I do know there's a lot of programming going around fashion and circularity in New York, that I do know. Okay, great. We do have some folks, maybe we can bring in some other panelists, people to answer questions as well. But I want to move on to some of the how here. We talked about a lot of lessons learned and also what's the goal here and kind of aligning visions. A lot of moving towards circularity involves multi-sector collaboration. And depending on the city, what those sectors might be different. So I want to talk about how receptive the different sectors have been to a circular ambition and how did you engage them on your plans? So let's talk to parties about City of Cambridge. City of Cambridge famously has several large universities. Can you talk a little bit about university involvement? And then also, though, I do know you have some thoughts on ARPA for businesses as well.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. So as I mentioned previously, we're in the final stages of presenting our circular plan, but in the process of implementing the plan, we did talk to the universities, obviously Harvard and MIT being our largest universities here in Cambridge. And I should mention also some of our top employers here in the city, as well as us as the city, we're one of the top employers too. So they're important not only from the sense of the academic institutions they are, but also in the sense of employers. So we talked to them about, implementing circular economy initiatives, and they also engaged with us about what they've been doing around, especially some of their greenhouse gas reductions and other things. And I think they're definitely interested in being involved in, and doing what they can around circular economy. And I think for them, a lot of that could be the low-hanging fruit of food waste initiatives and others. And Andrew, feel free to chime in on this as well. But I think the other opportunity that we have not really involve the universities in as much is around the opportunity for pitch nights and in sessions for entrepreneurs to tell us about circular programs or startups and companies that could help some of our other businesses here in Cambridge. And so I think for us, an opportunity with especially Harvard and MIT is that we can work with them to get more involved in helping us rethink and helping a lot of our businesses rethink and entrepreneurs rethink how they can come into the economy with a circular lens. So that could be, solving some of these issues we're having across the city and starting their own business in such a way. So that could be students at the university or some of the spin-outs we're already seeing from some of the quasi-public and institutional organizations. And then Jennifer, as you mentioned, I've talked to the panel a little bit about ARPA, so American Rescue Plan Act, which I hope many other cities are thinking about how they're using the funds. We've also, because we do have such a great support system from City Council, and some of our city councils are very much interested in us using funds for climate change initiatives, we are thinking about ways we can use the funds for spurring maybe like a local supply chain, plan for some of our commercial districts. So we can, help with some of these supply chain issues that so many of our business owners are facing right now. We're also thinking about just, ways we can help business owners in general with some of their other issues that they're dealing with when it comes to kind of what we're thinking around is, how are they mitigating these emergencies as they come up? So oftentimes the emergencies are actually flooding and other climate emergencies, but now with the pandemic as a different type of public health emergency, how are we making sure our business owners are resilient? So we're hoping to use some of our ARPA funds for that. And then I will say on the economic mobility side, I'm happy to say that our city council has allocated $2 million of our ARPA funds here at the city for our what we call Cambridge Rise, which is our guaranteed income program. So this is helping our households that are under the poverty line here in Cambridge and using our funds that way to help with our economic mobility programs. So, there are a lot of ways you can be very innovative with ARPA funds, especially if you can tie it to making your businesses more resilient. Happy to discuss more with folks on that, but I just wanted to highlight those few points from here in Cambridge.
Thank you. Really excited to see some of the creative ways to think about ARPA use, and also thinking about when we talk about sector partnerships, not just thinking like the business sector or the private sector, also thinking about universities. A lot of our really big cities have anchor institutions that can really be an asset to the circular transition. As I know, you the city of Seattle has been working with some business accelerators as a way to start new businesses in circularity. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So similar to Parties, we have a number of sort of business support schemes and grant schemes. I think Seattle really early on recognized that with the circular economy, you have to take a multi-sector approach. And as a city government, our role, we have a big role to play in enabling businesses and enabling community organizations to enter or be successful in the circular economy space. And so back in 2018, colleagues at Seattle Public Utilities launched our Waste-Free Communities matching grants, and that's $200,000 worth of grants every 2 years that go to businesses or nonprofits or community organizations with a very explicit focus on waste prevention and community engagement and enabling community benefits. More recently, there's a few organizations locally and regionally like Seattle Good Business Network and Zero Waste Washington who have set up a pitch competition called Pre-Cycle Innovation Challenge, which is aimed at startups and students to really get people thinking about circular economy ideas. There's also a more advanced phase run by a different coalition of organizations called Next Cycle, which applies to the whole state. and that provides business support as well as grants to startups and coalitions, again, that are working on circular economy projects to get them investment ready. So as a city, we provide financial support for each of those challenges and competitions and so on. We also provide sort of technical expertise and coaching and things like that. So it's a really valuable way of partnering with community and ensuring that money and grants and investment is getting to the right groups. And I'll also mention a slightly different form of multi-sector collaboration, which is a program called Reuse Seattle. And I think that in addition to kind of the role that we can play in grants and small business accelerators, this is a truly sort of public-private collaboration that has been kicked off, which is focused on moving Seattle from using single-use plastic packaging towards reusable packaging. And so, again, in a coalition between the city, music venues, sports stadiums, other private organizations like PR3 and Cascadia Consulting, we're exploring different ways that we can get Seattle to a sort of reusable packaging system. So starting with stadiums, starting with a few music venues in the city, working with a provider called Our Cup. And so really just exploring what role can the city play in supporting these kinds of efforts? How do we continually make sure we're working with the private sector to support activities like this? So those are just some of the ways that Seattle's kind of approaching multi-sector collaboration.
Fantastic. Thank you. So many different ways to think about bringing different sectors together for some partnerships. Divya, I know that Cleveland, you've told me, is kind of moving in this direction more towards partnering with the business sector on some of the circularity goals that you've developed. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So Circular Cleveland here for us, we are a nonprofit organization that's working with the city. So in addition to bringing multi-sectors on board, we are thinking of the city as one of those big stakeholders that needs to come fully and embrace this as well. So when your city is not on board, when your policies are not set up and there's no driver, you have to use other levers to bring other partnerships, because what's a nonprofit going to do in this space trying to bring some of these partnerships, especially if it's a community development nonprofit. So the grant that we generously got through Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has allowed us to use some of our economic development incentives to invite some of these partnerships and also begin to then use those partnership dollars to bring more people into the conversation as folks that will come into this little hub of discussion. So we're focusing a small amount of money going into with our manufacturing and advocacy network, because all along they've just been saying the manufacturing industry does not want to come together and talk about sustainability without, again, like Curtis, you mentioned, you need to have, and others have mentioned here, you need to have some of those funds in order for people to be able to transition. Without that, it's not useful. So it's been helpful for us to say, hey, you guys are you're doing a pitch on a regular basis. Can you introduce a small track in that pitch that's going to incorporate? We have a small amount of money, but we need to identify what are those partnerships and what are people in the area region thinking about in circularity and in terms of sustainability, that we can even begin to have those conversations, identify then what resources are needed to generate that landscape, and then look for resources that can come in. So we've actually been using that as a central piece to then say, hey, university, this group has come together to talk about this and wants to do something like this. Do you have your students who are interested in any of these ideas? And do you have your incubation groups? For example, a university here has a community-facing makerspace that also does business incubation, and that's working with 3D printers and other things. This, if you look at it in an interesting way and provide some resources and a landscape benefit to them, is a good way to bring that partnership to think about circularity and sustainability. When you talk about additive, so there's ways to do that. And in not having the city on board, we've had to use creative partnerships and creative tech, engagements to then make a case so that the city can see that this is working from the outside. So we see that, we've had to use all kinds of creative strategy. And again, the big part of it, it just takes time, especially with administration changes happening across every place, every city. And when that administration change happens, also there is a landscape change within that city, people from the city moving into pivotal roles in those partnerships. Now trying to track those people to say who've heard about these conversations in the past, and if their organizations are able to, if they were previously not at the table, but through if any of the stakeholder engagements, they're at a pivotal sector, we're trying to invite them into the conversation to see how that how that will bring their space into and their priorities into this transition.
Awesome, thank you. We have a couple questions from our attendees that I want to address. Andrew, there was a question about procurement and how cities can use procurement to advance circular goals. And I know that you and I have talked about this before. It's actually a big part of the strategy that Metabolic recommends. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the first lever that seems obvious to reach for if you're willing to spend money. It's a big if. But when we're talking about creating a sort of local demand for secondary materials, if the city, probably the easiest people for the city to convince are themselves, maybe, depending on the internal politics of the city. But if they already have environmentally preferable procurement policies in place, making a small addition to that to prefer always buying recycled or secondary materials for offices, for buildings, for events, whatever it may be, it's a great way to already create a local market signal. Now, that market signal is going to go beyond the borders of the city. One of the things we also talk about in the circular economy is that there's only certain loops that are going to be closed within the city, and then metropolitan area, county, state, the region of the US is when you're going to start to sort of balloon it out a little bit more. But already, for example, if you're talking about new infrastructure or buildings, this is a big project, you can put in sort of stretch clauses in the tender or in the RFP where you will give preference to bidders who can show that they can divert X amount of waste, or that can use up to X% of recycled concrete in the building, or X% of secondary, defined as recycled, reused, or repaired materials in the structure of the building. That gets tricky because they have to start balancing it with the building code, but certainly something that we've seen over in Europe, where city governments have a lot more ownership over some of the land that they're tendering it out. They can put a lot more requirements in, so those are hard requirements rather than bonuses you can get. The other thing we've seen that's really nice is, especially with building and construction projects and business permitting, to offer preferential permitting to folks who can prove that their business model sort of reduces waste, or makes use of a common waste stream in the city, or provides a secondary material to the city. I think in Philadelphia, Emily, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there was already quite some codes around buildings being able to prove the diversion from during construction and the diversion during operation of the building. That already creates a sort of built-in mechanism for creating these systems.
Thanks. And thank you for hopping it over to Emily. Emily, you are obviously the Smart Cities Director in Philadelphia, so I'm sure you have a lot to say about the use of technology to advance circular goals.
Yeah, I actually got the question a lot, why circularity would sit beneath the Smart Cities work and not ground in the environment. And I think there's two reasons. One is, I think, to enable a circular state, technology is critical, right? I don't think we can achieve that circular state without technology being the foundation. But also, I don't know how it is in other cities, maybe not so much in Seattle, but environment tends to be a highly political topic, whereas kind of technology and innovation is less so. And so it slightly removes that political lens, which allows us to get more done. And that ties back to two things that Andrew just spoke, or I have two examples of procurement that Andrew just spoke about. One is definitely in terms of the green building components. Procurement is easily the biggest lever that a city has to impact circularity. And one of the reasons that I think the preferential treatment of projects that have more components of reused materials is because it doesn't cost the city anything. And that's like right up our alley when we have a tight budget, right? We can offer incentives that are cost-free to us, but because we can accelerate the permitting process, it saves money for the business. And that's a really easy, I'll use easy in quotation marks because nothing's really easy working in a city, but an easy win. But another example of procurement that we are working on here in the city of Philadelphia, kind of in tangent to our strategy, is in the food systems. And we're not looking at waste so much as driving it, but really we're looking at, we procure $25 million worth of food for food insecure Philadelphians. That's $25 million of power that we have as a city, and reshaping how we do that whole system, right? So currently what we do is we procure from a company in Brooklyn 60,000 meals a day that are delivered in single-use plastic. We have 2 rivers that surround Philadelphia, so we have a huge issue with plastics in our waterway. The food that we're providing is not of the highest level of nutrients that we could potentially give to them. For example, we don't provide salad because we don't provide silverware, right? So there's a health impact that we're looking at in terms of the food that we procure. There's emissions because we're trucking in 60,000 meals a day, which is several semis coming through, most likely communities where there's higher rates of asthma and respiratory issues in communities of opportunity. And so we started to look and work. We tried to partner with our Parks and Recs team who does this. They were not as keen. No matter how much we educated them, they were like, listen, it's just important that they get the food. We don't want anything to mess up the process. Totally understand that. For anybody who knows me, my response was like, great, I understand that, but I see a lot of value in this. So I'm going to go find another way to do this. And so we worked with the Department of Health and the Department of Procurement as a partner to develop an application that looks at, can we explore opportunities in the city to procure that amount of food? So can the local supply meet the demand that we have? And so right now we're working with the local company, or the city is working with the local company. I no longer do that. To determine if we can use small businesses or catering schools, catering companies to have a more distributed model to provide this food. And then the scaling up would be, we utilize those, but we utilize reusable containers because we already have the cleaning infrastructure in place by utilizing the restaurants, and we deliver and collect at the same location. So the process is there. Can we then start to tap into our regional or agriculture? We're in a really food wealthy area. So can we start to create that food supply chain regionally? And can we start to look even at culturally appropriate foods? I think that that's something that's often overlooked when we're providing food to certain communities. We're giving them hot dogs, and maybe they would prefer something that's more culturally appropriate. So can we start to kind of create these systems changes that help feed them, get them healthier, reduce the air pollution? Can we use local electric transit? So that's just an example of the ripple effect. And I wanted to kind of share of procurement. Just $25 million can have that massive impact. And it's not going to be overnight, but its value is staying in the city of Philadelphia, which is what you really want to do when you're procuring stuff.
Thank you so much for that example. The cities are already spending so much money. So when we think about where our opportunities to use the money for the most impact, that is such a big area. The procurement process and the budgets that are already developed for things that we're already buying. There could be such ripple effects from something you are already buying. So I want to jump to another topic here that we've kind of been dancing around, and there's questions in the chat. The intersection of circular economy, climate change, social justice, economic mobility, kind of all of those things wrapped together. And what I mean by that is we often talk about circular economy as a sustainability initiative. Emily made the point, people ask her all the time, why is circular work not in the sustainability office or the environmental office? But a lot of it has to do with economics as well. And this is not just about sustainability, climate change, and material use, although that is a big part of it as well. One reason to go circular, to have circular goals, is because of the impact it can have on economic mobility for citizens in cities that have historically been left out and marginalized and kept out of economic opportunity. There was a question, Emily, earlier about Charlotte specifically. Charlotte for a long time had some of the worst economic mobility in the United States of all cities. And there was a question about what are some specific examples of initiatives that addressed economic mobility using a circular lens?
Yeah, so what really drove the circularity roadmap for Charlotte was the fact that they were ranked 49th out of 50 of the top cities in the United States for economic mobility, which meant that a child born into poverty had a 4% chance of getting out of poverty in his or her lifetime, which is staggering considering that Charlotte vacillates between second and third largest financial city in the United States, behind or swapping with San Francisco, depends on the day. And so that was really where all the businesses came together and said, this is what we want to work on, is we want to create an economic task force. We want to focus on this. And I think anything successful at that time had to kind of back into it, right? So when we pitched the circular economy strategy, we said, listen, circularity is not about white collar jobs. It's not about having a degree. There's opportunities throughout the application of it to create jobs for returning citizens, hard to employ, underskilled, and all that can create living wages, because essentially what you're doing is creating new streams of economic revenue through existing resources. And so when we worked on it, some of the low-hanging fruits were things like taking composting that was already happening, adding a black soldier fly project, which is an opportunity to create jobs for somebody to kind of manage those black soldier flies, which sounds really gross, and take some of that and grind it up for livestock and then transport it to somebody that's using it for livestock. There are opportunities, you know, I'm trying to remember, it's been a while since I've dove deep into the circular Charlotte strategy. And Andrew actually might have more of an idea, but the goal of the city manager when we developed it, he said, I want somebody who's currently working in the sanitation department collecting waste and is homeless, because that was one of the great things that Charlotte did, was they hired individuals, even if they were living in a shelter, to provide them with opportunity. And I want in 5 years' time for them to be able to have an idea and innovate on it and become an entrepreneur and start their own company. And that was the basis of the vision for what we did in Circular Charlotte.
Great, thank you. And again, also that thinking about that vision, it's a vision setting exercise to have a very specific picture in your head of what you are trying to achieve when it comes to economic mobility. Divya, all of the work you are doing with Cleveland Neighborhood Progress is aiming to lift up historically marginalized citizens with circular economy, with circularity. Can you talk more about how that's been going and how you involve the different participants in the social sector in your work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So as I started off saying that for us, it was about using those common practices and commonly practiced habits that because communities did that out of need. Cleveland, often tops the poverty list. We often, talk of Rust Belt cities as ones that don't have enough resources in them. But we also began to see how neighborhoods and communities, given the resources that they had, even through small amounts of grants, were able to create their own resources and fill back the needs within their community. So, so that's one of the approaches that we have, is that the goal of this initiative, in addition to tackling, in the umbrella of sustainability, it's putting back all these resources back into the community. Again, talking about redistribution models, talking about how do we have, there are immigrant communities that come into Cleveland that set up restaurants, right? I mean, they have a great menu, but they could focus on their menu. They could focus on hiring people at the right rate. If we were able to redistribute maybe tables and chairs from some places that was closing down back into these communities, so the infrastructure is then, sort of helpful for them. So the goal of the Circular Cleveland Project, as we keep thinking about it, is to repair stuff, redistribute stuff, and sort of localize things that they can buy, give, barter, sort of repair, do all those things within themselves. Also, that just localizes the whole supply chain at some level. right? And it's also if you're repairing these things and putting them back in. There was one project that we had, her goal was to provide a safe and dignified shopping experience for returning citizens. And what she would do is to work with local dry cleaners and laundromats to go pick up things that weren't previously picked up and curate them. She would work and she would call out for donations in neighborhoods that had, in suburbs and in other places, and have good clothing. She would curate them and then she would have popcorn and other things for people to spend their time, browse through and pick up the materials and the things that they needed. She's thinking about adding other consumer related goods. And then there was another, so the Circular Cleveland model also works with ambassadors here. And ambassadors here are from the community who are helping us understand what the community needs are in addition to the grants that we've had. The ambassadors are coming together to figure out how do we support projects like these from what we see within our communities. Can we now identify consumer goods? There's one group that's talking about fix-it clinics. The idea of thinking about fixing some of these things and bringing them into places like this so they can be redistributed back into the community, so that we're constantly not talking about food deserts and resource deserts, but we're sort of equipping them back into the skill of being able to do these kinds of things, starting at a level of community resource. Then this allows for economic mobility as we sort of think about repairing becoming its own skilled project, or so that's how we are approaching what we want here in Cleveland. So we're hoping to focus several of our initiatives rooted from the community side, and then working with the private sector to see what kinds of supports they can bring back. Again, this is along the area of food also. So when we have a food incubator, how are they going to work with the Hunger Network and the farmers who glean to be able to create value-added products that can be put back in some of these neighborhoods where there are fewer grocery stores or food insecure communities. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Divya. And thanks for folks that are asking questions, by the way. Also just wanted to make a note, given the discussion we're having, I'm just going to keep taking questions as we go and not necessarily leave time at the end. So if you do have questions, keep sending them in. We are incorporating them into the conversation for most of the ones we're getting. Last question on this topic for right now. I know, Andrew, you've talked about how equity can be an issue in just the models that are proposed by circular economy in the first place. One of the examples you've given me before is product as a service. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things we should watch out for when thinking about this transition to circularity, and thinking about how do we make sure we're not just running into a pothole really when implementing some circular practices?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good one. For me, it kind of starts and ends with the question of ownership. You can talk about who owns the land, who owns the product, who owns the benefits of the circular economy. And I'll break that down. So in talking about sort of who owns the land, if you're building a circular built environment, you're trying to deal with housing, what you're going to come up against is that land is like the most fundamental form of wealth in our economic system. And so it is highly susceptible to speculation and all kinds of sort of absentee investors, and doesn't really get treated as a human right. One of the ways around this, when you're looking at building out, meeting all the human needs within your city, is looking at alternative models like community land trusts. For me, in a circular economy, one of the first things I think of also is that what you're trying to do is build connectivity locally, connectivity between you and your neighbors, between businesses and other businesses. So you get industrial symbiosis going, so people know what's available to them and don't have to duplicate purchases or duplicate efforts in order to meet their same human needs, right? This is what we often talk about with product as a service business models, is that a car sits idle for like 90% of its lifespan. A drill is like 99.9% of its lifespan sitting idle. So really, realistically, you only need one of these for a certain number of people. The same thing can be said for sort of the amount of land. You want to be connecting people on that land who are helping each other out, actually. You want to build this social cohesion. This is a major aspect of resilience. For me, a model that I love to look at is community land trusts, where a community buys a parcel of land and keeps it in a trust, and without sort of unfairly depriving any of the owners of the value of that land. Should one of them choose to sell their home, the community, there's a process in place to prevent that from going straight to the open market, and actually it can be kept in the community as a home for community members in an economically fair way. That's on the land side. When we get into products as a services, this is in circular business models. This is the most common circular business model you hear. People say circular economy, it's like either they say recycling or they say product as a service, or you don't own the car, you rent it, you have the access to it, you're paying for access to the car. It's the same thing with actually your Kindle library. You don't own any of those books on your Kindle, you just have a lifetime access to it, but you can't pass it on to anyone else in your will, for example, because you don't actually have ownership. Now, if you take this product as a service model and blow it up to like, turn it up to 11 and you sort of expand it, but what if we made everything in our city product as a service? What you'd end up with is a relatively small number of organizations who own all the buildings, all the furniture, all the lights, all the cars, all the scooters, all the textiles, all the jeans, pairs of jeans, all the shoes, whatever it is. And then individuals are just receiving money from their work and spending it out, and they're not actually building any assets for themselves. So that's where that's a very far in the future sort of concern, just to say that you can't go all in on product as a service blindly. And this brings me to the last point, which is the question of ownership of benefits. When you're looking at the circular economy business models that you're creating, who stands to benefit from these incentives, from these procurements, from these accelerators? And a lot of the examples we've already heard of today are cities who are taking really good care of targeting that incentive at a certain group. Or a certain community, because otherwise, what we often talk about is you risk gentrifying the circular economy. So circular economy practices have been around for pretty much ever because they've been born out of scarcity. You have to make the most use of your resources when you have limited resources. And so in many places, you see something like a pawn shop or a shoe repair shop, and they don't get the sexy label of circular economy. They're not really prioritized in the storytelling, in the incentives, in the policy, capacity building, what have you. And instead, people are bringing in packaging-free grocery stores, which really appeal to my demographic, young, full-time employed, highly educated folks. So there's a balance to be struck between attracting in outside circular economy businesses, and actually what I prefer is building up what you already have in your city, sort of celebrating them for what they are and helping them expand so that they can really own the benefits of that switch.
Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, just to again, underline that last point, making sure that the people in the city are owning the benefits of this transition, and we're not creating systems that are just benefiting other people that are coming in from the outside. People already live in these cities, and we want the folks that already live there to benefit from this transition. So moving to our last topic area, when we talk about circularity, sometimes the conversation can veer off into the recycling conversation. I mentioned in my intro that moving to circularity is not just about more recycling, right, or waste diversion or waste management. It's about upstream solutions. A lot of what we've talked about here as examples are upstream solutions. And by upstream, I mean solutions that change the way we use goods and materials so meaningfully that it prevents the creation of waste and excess use, material use. So how do we move from focusing on recycling to focusing on upstream solutions when we want to make this transition to circularity happen? Ash, Seattle has a really high rate of recycling already, or at least higher than the national average, but you said before, the goal is not 100% recycling. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as most people know, that city like Seattle, we have been a sort of environmental leader and a leader nationally on recycling and composting for some time. And so we're at about diversion rate of 60% and have a very successful citywide composting program, which is definitely a blessing. But leadership a few years ago sort of raised the question of, is we know we want to increase our recycling rates and composting rates, but is that really the end goal? Is that what we should be trying to move towards? Because we could, as Seattleites, still be generating large volumes of trash and waste that get recycled and composted, but we would rather actually be producing less and consuming less waste in the first place. And so in our most recent solid waste comprehensive plan, and more generally in our sort of strategic business plan of the utility especially, we've got a significant focus and shift to upstream and preventing waste. And so we're emphasizing solid waste metrics that are focused on waste generation rather than just the recycling rate. All of our programming is very much focused on, again, can we encourage repair and reuse and remanufacturing in our city rather than just focusing on more and more recycling? And I think there's two main reasons for that sort of mentality shift. One is that the waste prevention and focusing upstream has the greatest environmental gains of any strategy. So think about carbon emissions, think about toxins, think about pollutants. And then similar to what a lot of others have said, there's a massive economic development angle. So the more that we focus on design and innovation and repair and reuse, the more job opportunities there are, the more innovation opportunities there are, the more you can bring technology into the conversation. So it opens up this whole different discussion, which we wouldn't necessarily be having if we're just focused on downstream measures. So that has been a really interesting shift for Seattle over the last few years. And it's a really exciting time for us because we have a sort of waste prevention strategic plan coming out in a few years and a lot of support for upstream and design measures, which is really encouraging.
Great, thank you. And then Emily, just quickly, could you talk about the construction demolition work that Charlotte and Philadelphia have done? Because I think that's a really, no pun intended, concrete example of an upstream solution.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with what Charlotte did, so I'm gonna not share that because I don't want to be or to misinform folks, but I can talk about what Philadelphia has done. So as one of my first projects as Smart Cities Director, we launched a call for solutions around how to support our zero waste target by 2035. Andrew and Metabolic, to continue with that theme, were selected as one of our finalists. We had two, both were focused on circularity actually. But Andrew was looking to adapt an urban mining tool that Metabolic had developed for the country of the Netherlands to map their construction and demolition or C&D waste and identify where reuse could happen. So we were looking to do that in Philadelphia. One of the great things about Philadelphia is that we have not had a significant fire like New York City or Chicago, where a lot of our building structures were damaged. So we have an amazing amount of resources here in the city of Philadelphia in terms of construction and demolition waste. And we're also going through a period of really rapid development. So there's a lot of big projects going on in our city. And so we thought that the urban mining tool would be great. And we were able to take some data, extrapolate a lot of data, because as we mentioned earlier, we can't let not having data get in our way, and our C&D waste data was not the best. And we were able to just determine what were the highest, what resources we had that would have the highest value for reuse, and anticipate based on where we were having development, where those demands would be. And so it was a really great opportunity to just take something and something as simple as construction demolition waste that I don't think anybody gives any thought to. I know that we have a huge issue with illegal dumping of C&D waste in our city. And the thought was, could this be a non-enforcement way to reduce that illegal dumping as well? So there's the social environmental justice kind of component to this project. And so right now we are kind of pausing on that while we develop the strategy, but it's a hugely grassroots kind of company uptake that we need in order to scale it up to fully deploy across Philadelphia.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that great example. So we are almost out of time here today, and I want to end by giving everyone an opportunity to talk about how can we start. A lot of the attendees here today, some are from city government, some are from nonprofits, some are just private citizens or entrepreneurs. I was a just regular citizen when I started Circular Triangle as well. So I'm going to give everyone about 30 seconds just to answer the question of, as citizens or entrepreneurs, if you don't work for a city, for example, how and where to begin? Is it like showing up to city council meetings? How do you start? I will actually start myself just by talking about Circular Triangle very briefly. Circular Triangle started as literally a breakfast meeting group. We met monthly for breakfast at a local shop just to gather like-minded people. And we talked about circularity. We talked about what we were hearing. We heard about this conference called Circularity that several years ago. It was in Minneapolis. And so several of us went. We heard about this place called Metabolic, and we heard about Charlotte, and we started reaching out. And we started the process that way. So I would say for my answer for this is, how do I start? It's to gather like-minded individuals and start seeing what connections can be made, what's already happening in the city, and reaching out to others that are already doing this work, because there's a lot of really great learnings to be had from other cities. Emily, Ash, Pardees, Divya, then Andrew. Do you mind just giving a quick, where do you start? Emily, do you want to go first?
As soon as I can unmute myself. Yeah, I think just to echo what you said, I think that if you're not in the city, there are a lot of ways to get involved. You know, go to the environment committee meetings that your city hosts every month or whatever that frequency is. Reach out to your city staff that work in the sustainability department or in the economic development. We are employed by you, right? A city's job is to provide services to the community. So they should respond and want to sit and meet with you. Go on meetup.org and see if there are people that are interested in recycling textiles or starting a Fix It club, where you can go to a park each weekend, put out some flyers and say, hey, if you have a device that doesn't work, bring it and we'll see if we can fix it. I think it requires creativity. I think it requires persistence. So even if you hit some roadblocks, if you feel strongly about this, keep moving forward. It can even be as simple as composting and getting a group of composters together, starting a local garden. There's just a lot of ways to get involved. Just find your passion.
Thanks, Emily. Pardees.
Yeah, just to highlight on with Emily, I mean, here in Cambridge, we have Facebook groups that are zero waste and all about making sure, you know, these residents are interested in that. So I would definitely encourage folks for, you know, to look at what, you know, social media and other resources are available for you to find like-minded people. And with entrepreneurs, Emily's right. The city is here to serve you. You know, here in Cambridge, that's our job. So if you have an idea and we can be helpful to you to make sure that you can be successful and grow, then definitely reach out. And I would encourage folks, if there are issues, you know, definitely talk to your city officials and make sure that they're aware of things that you'd like to see the city do or prioritize. And I'd also mention, you know, our different departments here at the city do different things like fix-it clinics and other items around circularity to support our residents who are interested in that. And I would just say, make sure to, you know, keep in tune with what your municipality is doing in addition to, you know, your community members, because there's a lot of different resources out there that are free and available to you.
Thanks. Ash?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Emily and Pardees have said. I think the only two things I'd add there is one, that as you're sort of exploring, know that it will not always be called circular economy activity. And so keep an open mind and sort of look for other vocabulary that is related. And then I'd also say, like, as an individual, identify your unique value add or perspective. Maybe it's that you have, you're very involved in your local neighborhood or local community organization. And is there a circularity element you can bring into those conversations? Or do you work at like a large corporate in a city? And maybe that's the way that you enter the conversation and make sure that your company is going to start talking to the city or county government about circularity. So reflecting on what your unique perspective and value add could be to the circularity conversation, I think is important.
Thank you. Divya.
Ash, I really like that point that you elevated about bringing in your personal value add, and I think I echo what everybody has said so far. Emily, Pardis, Ashima, Jennifer, Andrew. I'm sure that's going to be a thread. But what I will say is work happens at the speed of trust, and to be honest and have intentional conversations, and to be able to, this is all about social cohesion again, to both address resilience, it's about addressing everything, it's about that social cohesion. Circularity itself is all about those connections. So to be able to openly welcome people to a conversation and actively to be able to seek what they bring to the table, to be able to connect with what you have. And the other thing that I was very valuable for us here is to map out the players and have some sort of a way to go without a blank slate, because it's overwhelming to start at a blank slate. To have some language and to map out the initial partners so everyone's an ambassador as we sort of build this together.
Andrew, anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, I really love a sort of Venn diagram that was propagated in the All We Can Save, or the podcast How to Save a Planet by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnston. She has a Venn diagram of what does the world need, or what does the city need? What are you good at, and what brings you joy? What do you like to do? And if you can find something that ticks off 2 of those 3, you probably have a good job. If you find something that ticks off all 3, that's your sweet spot. And then on 2 very practical levels, if you're in touch with your city, one great way of sort of a backdoor entry into circular economy is to talk to the climate, any team on the climate team, and ask them about consumption-based emissions or scope 3 emissions, because that immediately gets you back to materials and a circular economy. And then if you're a business and you have products that you use or that you design, pick one and see if you can make it more circular. And in both cases, in your own personal actions at home, in your business, whatever, keep track of what's really difficult. If there's missing information, missing infrastructure, if it's not legal to do what you want to do, that's very valuable information to be sharing with city leaders, other business leaders, and other individuals.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all the panelists for your time today, and thanks for all of our attendees. This was a really exciting conversation, and it covered a lot of different topics. Anna put in the chat where to find more. There's panels and events all week. This is Circular Cities Week, both online events and I think in-person events as well in New York City. So if you want to learn more, or if your question wasn't answered, there's probably a panel dedicated to that exact thing. So check out the rest of Circular Cities Week. And thank you again to our panelists. Hope you have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.